To the age of 39, Ulysses S. Grant had lived a life unremarkable in every way. He'd been a merely competent Army officer and a failure as a farmer and a businessman. But with the coming of the Civil War, Grant found his destiny and secured his place in American history. Now, to trace Grant's footsteps from battlefield to battlefield is to witness the birth and growth of a military genius. And these fields, where the blood of so many Civil War soldiers was shed, are a testament to his single-minded pursuit of victory. Grant's campaign included crucial battles along the Tennessee and the Mississippi rivers, and these encounters ultimately determined the fate of the war and the future of our nation. I'm Bill Boggs, visiting the sites of some of Ulysses S. Grant's most significant battles, places worth visiting for every historic traveler. Today's journey starts with Grant's sweeping victory in the rugged hills around Chattanooga, Tennessee, then moves west to the sites of earlier battles at Shiloh and Vicksburg, where Grant learned the lessons that reshaped him into one of America's great military heroes. The story of General Grant's first unqualified success at Chattanooga begins at a different battlefield under the command of a different general. Chickamauga sits around 6 miles south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, across the state line in Georgia. And in the fall of 1863, General William Rosecrans led Union troops through some of the fiercest fighting of the Civil War. Confederates had pushed their way northward and were trying to press their way into Chattanooga. General Rosecrans's Federals held them off here for 2 bloody days. This rustic Civil War cabin, the Snodgrass Cabin, still marks the spot where a Union division led by General George Thomas made its last defiant stand. That defiant stand against the rebels who charged across this meadow and up this hill earned him the nickname Rock of Chickamauga. But Thomas's defiance came at a price. In 2 days of fighting, the blue and gray together had suffered 34,000 killed, wounded, or captured. Casualties were beginning to pile up here at the Gordon Lee Mansion, which had been pressed into service first as the Union headquarters and later as the main hospital. Today, the Gordon Lee Mansion is a bed and breakfast and a National Historic Site. Imagine General Rosecrans and his men plotted their strategies in this very parlor. This gracious reminder of the Old South is located just outside the battlefield. It has only 5 guest rooms, so early reservations are highly recommended. Finally, overwhelmed by its losses, the Union Army abandoned Chickamauga. They retreated north to Chattanooga, and the Confederates followed right on their heels, taking up positions on Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain high above the city. You can still get a feel for the Northern Army's desperate position by taking a trip to the top of Lookout Mountain on the Incline Railway. It's the steepest passenger railway in the world, with outstanding views of the historic mountains and valleys. The incline is open year-round and makes 3 to 4 trips per hour. As you reach the summit, you can see how the rebel army, from its dominant position, was able to lay siege to Chattanooga. From these sheer bluffs, the rebel troops were able to shell river traffic and the main rail lines leading into Chattanooga, hoping to force the Union Army into surrender. Within a month, the 60,000 Union troops below in the town were on the verge of starvation. With roads and rail lines cut off by Confederate shelling, the Federals had run out of food, equipment, and ammunition. They cut down every tree in town and were reduced to tearing down houses for lumber to build fortifications. When President Lincoln heard that the Confederates had Chattanooga cut off, he dispatched his strongest commander, General Ulysses Grant. Local historian Jerry Desmond says that within days of his arrival, Grant began to turn the situation around.
Well, as soon as Lincoln dispatched Grant, he sent in an additional 36,000 troops. Grant opened the supply lines and soon took the offensive on an unforgettable mountainside battle.
A walking tour of Point Park will take you to many of the important sites in the Battle for Lookout Mountain. You can actually see the story of the battle told in this huge painting at the Point Park Visitor Center. It's called the Battle Above the Clouds, and it memorializes a dramatic natural phenomenon that aided the Union cause. In the early morning hours of November 24, 1863, General Grant ordered his troops across the creek and up the treacherous slopes of Lookout Mountain. A cover of clouds enveloped the summit of the mountain, throwing the soldiers fighting on the slopes into total confusion.
Well, it was so foggy that the Confederate soldiers were soon unable to distinguish between friend and foe. In fact, the angle here was so steep that they couldn't depress their cannons and rifles enough to shoot at the advancing Union Army. Eventually, they took cannonballs and lit the fuses and just threw them off the mountainside.
By midday, the Union soldiers had pushed the rebels out of their main defenses here at the Craven's house, destroying the building in the process. The Craven's house was rebuilt after the war and today is one of the few homes of the era still standing. Lookout Mountain is said to be the most photographed site of the Civil War. Even General Grant took time out for a quick snapshot. If you choose to have your picture taken here, be forewarned. Roper Rock is named for a soldier who came here to have his picture taken and took one step back too many and fell to his death. As the battle continued, the conditions worsened. The Confederates kept losing ground, which sent them retreating up the precarious slopes of the mountain. By the next morning, Union troops had control of the summit. All that remained for Grant now was to push the Southern troops out of their remaining positions on Missionary Ridge to the east of town. The next day, General Grant directed an assault on the ridge from his headquarters here at Orchard Knob. This monument marks Grant's command post, where he watched his men scale the heights of the ridge without orders in one of the great charges of the Civil War. Within hours, the Confederate lines collapsed and the rebel troops fled to Georgia during the night. The battle for Chattanooga was over, with the Union in control and Grant's reputation as a leader firmly in place. The next stop on our journey takes us 200 miles west along the Tennessee River and 18 months before the Battle of Chattanooga to a place called Shiloh and a time before the name U.S. Grant became synonymous with victory. Across these fields, a horrific battle raged for 2 days. Men stepped over yesterday's dead to fight each new day's battle. When it was over, it was the bloodiest conflict to that point in American history. Nothing in Ulysses S. Grant's past had prepared him for the carnage. In fact, after graduating from West Point in 1843, his Army career was largely undistinguished. After 11 years in uniform, low pay forced Grant to resign from the Army, but that only made his financial predicament worse. He hand-built a cabin in St. Louis for his family and then proceeded to fail miserably as a farmer, rent collector, customs clerk, and storekeeper. But the declaration of civil war in 1861 would give the 39-year-old Ulysses Grant one more chance to succeed in the U.S. Army. On the morning of Sunday, April 6, 1862, General Grant was enjoying a leisurely breakfast at the Cherry Mansion in Savannah, Tennessee. Grant had been ordered to set up camp nearby and await reinforcements. Little did he know that the rebels had other plans for his army. It was here that Grant first got word that the Confederates, led by General A.S. Johnston, had attacked his troops about 9 miles from here at a small church named Shiloh. The original Shiloh church was demolished, but this 20th century replacement marks the spot where Southern troops launched their surprise attack. You can see it today as the starting point on a 9.5-mile tour past the hundreds of monuments, cannons, and markers at the Shiloh battlefield. The Confederate attack here caught the Federals completely off guard. Local historian Kent Collier says that the Union officers had kept their men drilling instead of fortifying their positions.
They just didn't realize that the Confederate Army was poised on the outskirts of their camps, ready to attack. Once the attack commenced, the surprised Federal troops fled in panic.
Thousands of raw Northern recruits headed for the river to hide, but Grant's generals managed to cobble together a defensive line against a now disorganized Confederate assault. By mid-morning, Grant was fully in charge, and the Union troops had formed up a strong natural defensive position that earned a rather curious nickname. Well, Kent, this area is called the Hornet's Nest. How come?
Well, some of the most furious fighting of the battle occurred here. The Confederates massed about 17,000 troops, and they began pell-mell charges across this field. A Confederate soldier who survived one of the attacks here named it because of the sound of the bullets whistling in all directions. There was just so much fire, and it was so hot that's the way he described it.
The combat was murderously fierce, and Union troops were forced back inch by inch, all the way back to Pittsburgh Landing. Confident that they had won, the Confederate Army retired for the night. It proved to be a fatal mistake. In the late afternoon, the reinforcements Grant had been ordered to wait for finally arrived. Overnight, the general shuffled them into his lines, and at dawn, on April 7th, the Union counterattacked.
Well, Grant's strategy is to take his 25,000 fresh troops and send in wave after wave in spite of taking enormous casualties.
During the terrible days of fighting at Shiloh, the soldiers came right to this water to drink and to clean their wounds. But so many men and horses died all around here that the water was said to be stained red, and this became known as Bloody Pond. Grant's troops pushed the Confederates all the way back to Shiloh Church, and finally, Confederate General Beauregard ordered a retreat. Grant claimed a victory, but the death toll on both sides was staggering. During the two-day battle, almost 24,000 men were killed, wounded, or lost. Mass burial sites located throughout the battlefield contain the majority of the 1,700 Confederate soldiers killed in action at Shiloh. An equal number of Union dead are buried in the Shiloh National Cemetery, making it the bloodiest battle in North America to that date. Politicians and newspapers scream for Grant to be fired. General Grant was temporarily reassigned and for a while even considered resigning. But President Lincoln refused to fire Grant, saying, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Our journey tracing the Western campaign of Ulysses S. Grant now moves to the Mississippi River, the vital artery pumping the lifeblood of the South. Our destination is a city that served as the Confederacy's guard post on the mighty river, Vicksburg, Mississippi. It wouldn't be easy for Grant to repair the damage done to his reputation after his troops were caught by surprise at Shiloh, but he was determined to try. And he got his opportunity here, in Vicksburg, in a 9-month battle that will be remembered as Grant's masterpiece. The boldness of his military strategy marked him as a military genius of the first order. Terry Winchell is the park historian at the Vicksburg National Military Park. Well, Terry, what was so important about Vicksburg?
Bill, President Abraham Lincoln referred to Vicksburg as the key and said that the war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket.
With Northern newspapers still calling for Grant's head, the general knew he must win at Vicksburg. But the city's position on high bluffs overlooking a wide and marshy section of the river had earned it the nickname the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Capturing Vicksburg seemed nearly impossible. Because Vicksburg was heavily fortified along the river, Grant's first attack just before Christmas 1862 was from the north. You can get a glimpse of Grant's first attempt at taking Vicksburg with a Mississippi boat adventure. It's a hydrojet that takes you to the site of one of the last surviving Confederate river fortresses. And it lets you see it as Grant did for the first time. From the boat, we can see how the marshy terrain north of town absolutely defeated the Union troops trying to advance under heavy artillery fire. Finally, Grant ordered a retreat and came up with a new plan. He had his men dig a canal, that's it over there, in an attempt to divert the Mississippi River to bypass the Confederate troops who were well entrenched atop the hill city. It's quite an ambitious project, but it was a failure. After digging for weeks, Army engineers discovered that when the river flooded in, their canal wasn't deep enough. Throughout the winter, Grant tried various other schemes to detour around the swampland north of Vicksburg, but they all failed. In the end, he realized the only workable plan was to march his men down the west bank of the Mississippi, where they could link up with Navy supply ships and be ferried across the river. And in April of 1863, that's exactly what he did. The tricky part, as it turned out, was getting the supply boats past the Confederate artillery at Vicksburg. Grant accomplished this by having the cargo ships lashed to Federal gunboats, which made a daring night run past the Southern guns on April 16th. You can take a close look at one of those Union gunboats today. The USS Cairo was sunk by a mine early in the battle for Vicksburg, and parts of the salvaged ship are now on display at the Vicksburg National Military Park. Once the gunboats had united the men and supplies on the east bank of the river, Grant fought his way inland and captured Jackson, the Mississippi state capital.
With Jackson in his possession, Grant then turned his army west toward his objective, Vicksburg, and on the 18th day of May arrived on the hills you see in the distance here, reconnoitered the Confederate works, and prepared to strike.
The area around the city where the blue and the gray clashed is now the National Military Park, where 9 major Confederate forts, along with hundreds of markers and monuments, commemorate this long and arduous conflict. Grant's first charge at Vicksburg, which lasted several hours, was repulsed. So was a second, at a total cost of more than 4,000 casualties. With the memory of his losses at Shiloh still fresh in his mind, Grant realized that trying to take the city by storm was a serious mistake. He reluctantly decided that siege warfare was his best option. Grant supervised the emplacement of trenches and siege batteries. Soon, Union artillery was hammering away from gunboats in the west and the hilltops in the east. With the city surrounded, cut off from supplies, and under constant bombardment, Grant knew it was only a matter of time. And it made life very difficult for residents of Vicksburg. Some of the buildings still tell the story. The Cedar Grove Mansion, for example, was hit by Union artillery and still proudly displays this cannonball lodged in the parlor wall. The Visitor Center Museum in the Battle Park shows how the siege evolved into a war of nerves. On display is a model cave, typical of the limestone caverns where the residents sought refuge as the blockade dragged on. The siege lasted more than a month. But the Confederates, with little hope of relief, finally signed their surrender to Grant right here on July 4th, 1863. The Battle of Vicksburg was over. Here at the courthouse, the Confederate colors were struck and replaced by the Stars and Stripes. But Vicksburg wouldn't celebrate Independence Day on its surrender anniversary for almost 100 years. Today, this landmark of the Vicksburg skyline is a Civil War museum filled with artifacts offering mute testimony to Grant's determination, persistence, and military ingenuity. Grant had split the Confederacy in two and severed its lifeline in a single blow, with modest losses overall. The victory represented a turning point for Grant himself as well. He had at last silenced his critics and was now on the road that would lead to victory at Chattanooga, promotion to commander of all Union forces, and finally the presidency of the United States. Between Vicksburg and Chattanooga, other places of interest for the historic traveler include the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. The Lorraine is the site of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. Further south in Clarksdale, Mississippi is the Delta Blues Museum, a celebration of this unique American art form. And travelers may also want to make a trip to the historic river port of Natchez, Mississippi, with hundreds of the finest antebellum homes in the country, including Stanton Hall, one of America's largest Civil War era mansions. This journey, focusing on Grant's epic battles, is a must for anyone who loves Civil War history. After the battles of Chattanooga, Shiloh, and here at Vicksburg, the North knew that the end was in sight. For Grant, it meant redemption, vindication, and it marked his permanent place in our history. I'm Bill Boggs. Thanks for joining us on Historic Traveler.